Hello, everyone, and welcome to She Said, second groovy show focusing on the psychedelic Beatles, those Paisley and bell-bottom studio musicians of autumn 1966 through 1970. It was the age of self-discovery in which Timothy Leary urged us to tune in, turn on, and drop out. The hippies reminded us to make love, not war, but nonetheless, the war in Vietnam was still raging on, while waves of student protests swept across the rest of college campuses of America. The young bloods begged us to, come on, people now, shine on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now. And the Beatles, well, they penned All You Need Is Love and created a company designed to inspire and to help struggling musicians find their voice and their place in the world. And today we'll take you there. I'm Lanea Stagg, the culinary chef, the author of the Recipe Records series of rock and roll cookbooks full of interesting historical info, delicious recipes, rock and roll trivia and facts, and even great playlists to spin on your newfangled Alexa or other listening device as you cook. And if it's the late 60s and those dream-colored days that you love, let me tell you, all of my books have recipes straight from that magical era. For example, in Recipe Records, the 60s edition, you can whip up a Stone Soul picnic. And in my Recipe Records tribute to the Beatles, you can experiment with Mundo Paparazzi Ziti. You'll think you are right back in 1968 when you make the Helter Skelter Skillet, a fun recipe from the original Recipe Records book. And for you Stones fans, you can get your groove on with a heaping serving of delicious She's a Rainbow salad from my book, The Rolling Scones, Let's Spin the Bite Together. Check out all of these delicious and easy-to-make recipes and the stories behind them at LaneaStagg.com.
Yep, I know I have. In fact, all I have to say around my house is it's Recipe Records night, and my husband is smiling from ear to ear. And we're not kidding you guys. This is an experience that you don't want to miss because you're not only going to get these great recipes, but the stories behind them, the stories about the music and the musicians, music history, music trivia. You will absolutely love them. And I am Lena's co-host, Jude Southerland Kessler, author of the John Lennon Series. And Lena and our guest today and I are all here really celebrating and kicking up our heels because the three of us have been working very, very hard on Volume 5 in the John Lennon Series, Shades of Life Part 1. And it was just submitted actually for the second time. We had to look at the PDF over the weekend, find any errors from the publisher that were present in the PDF, and we just redid it and sent it back in this morning. So it is still in the process of coming off the press. And the people that are with me today did a ton, and I mean a ton of work to get this very lengthy and in-depth book about John's life. And of course, if it's John's life, it's also the Beatles' lives in 1965 ready to roll out. And I mean, we truly finished with only minutes to spare. But it will be out on 9 October 2021, and we are all really glad to have it submitted and in the hands of the printers. Now, if you want to pre-order the book and get a signed and dated copy, go to johnlennonseries.com and you can place your order. I was going to do 200 signed and numbered books, but there were a lot of people that did not get a chance to get a copy, so we've extended that to 250. We have about 30 copies left of the signed, numbered, and dated books. But you're going to love it. The lads make help. They go on that big European tour of Italy, France, and Spain. They very reluctantly, in John's case, accept the Queen's MBE nomination, and John publishes A Spaniard in the Works, and really reacts in a very wounded way, although he doesn't make it really publicly known. But he's very hurt by the solo release of Paul's first ever solo Beatles song, Yesterday. And it really is a very complicated story because it's tied into the release of Help and how John wanted to release Help but didn't get to. So there are lots of fun stories in there to share. But today our focus, as Lena says, is squarely on 67, 68, 69, and 70, because John, Paul, George, and Ringo, who were always looking for the next big thing, ventured into a business together, into the music industry, with really high and lofty ideas about helping new songwriters and singers and artists get a foothold in an industry that was not only complicated, but can often be really cliquish and hard to break into. Well, in order to do this, they created, as most of you know, Apple. And here to help us understand what the Beatles wanted to achieve with Apple and how they went about it and whom they selected to help make this really beautiful dream into a reality is one of our dear friends who is one of the most respected historians in the Beatles world. He's the executive editor of a magazine that the New York Times called Power Beatling, Beatlefan magazine. He's also the author of Changing Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation. Great book about the advent of the Beatles and were the Beatles really popular only because of the death of President John F. Kennedy, and clears up lots of myths like that. He also is a contributing author to 4 books by Bruce Spicer: The Beatles and Sgt. Pepper, A Fan's Perspective, The Beatles' White Album and the Launch of Apple, which is a great one for today, The Beatles Get Back to Abbey Road, and The Beatles Finally Let It Be. So I ask you, who would know more about those hectic, crazy days of Apple than our esteemed guest, Mr. Al Sussman. Al, welcome to She Said, She Said.
Ladies, how are you today?
Good.
We are so terrific.
Great.
How are you?
Good. Sort of baking in the middle of another Pittsburgh heat wave. But it's almost the middle of August, so pretty soon we'll be getting to the fall.
Yes. Right. Elena is not looking forward to that, I can tell you.
Well, yeah,
no, I'm
that's
not.
True, because we know what comes after that.
That's right. That is so right. So it's so wonderful to have you here, Al, and also just to back up everything that Jude said, we really appreciate you helping edit her latest wizardry into the life of John Lennon. It is a spectacular book, and I can't wait for everyone to read it and smile as I did every time I had the great opportunity to read it. It was just like being a fly on the wall with John and his mates. It's delightful.
It was my pleasure to help out and also to read it.
Well, thank you. I love you guys. I really appreciate it. It was a bunch of hard work, I'll tell you that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I'm sure.
You did a lot of work. I just pulled your folder out of the desk, Alan, looked at it, and Elaine, I have hundreds of Marcos. We went back and forth, and Janet Davis, I think I had, I'm going to say, 500 pages of edits. So thank goodness for you guys. Thank goodness, really and truly.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're
most
welcome.
Wonderful. Well, Al, Jude and I know the basic ABCs of Apple, but you are so well versed in the details and the nitty-gritty of how it all came to pass in swinging London during the late 60s. So Jude and I are going to do a lot of listening and learning today as you unveil the intricate world of Apple for us. So first things first, what was the origin of what became Apple, and how did it all come to be?
Well, actually, it's too bad that we don't have our buddy Bruce Spicer here, because Bruce is in his real life is a tax attorney, and he could fill us in on the kind of the intricacies of this, because Apple basically began as a tax shelter. it grew out of the need for the Beatles to invest a certain amount of their money or lose it in taxes. And Jude, you know the tax structure in England, certainly in that era.
Horrible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So they originally, Beatles Limited was in effect their original tax shelter. But in April of '67, that partnership became Beatles and Company. Each Beatle owned 5% of Beatles and Company, and the remaining 80% would go to a new corporation, which would be taxed at a much lower tax rate. So that's the
awesome.
that's the kind of the genesis, the immediate genesis of Apple.
Wow.
That's a necessity, and now that happens all the time for business people. So we know that Brian Epstein had for some time been struggling with his role within the Beatles world, and I guess it really all started in August of 1966 when the boys, at the conclusion of the North American tour, said they were going to halt live performances. In fact, George Harrison famously said at the end of the Candlestick concert, "That's it, I'm not a Beatle anymore." So, which, everybody says things, but Brian really felt at loose ends about his role in the lives of his four boys. So tell us, what was Brian's role in the early direction of this new venture called Apple?
Brian was actually very gung-ho about Apple at the very beginning, because he looked at it as a new enterprise, as a marketing opportunity, perhaps. And this is interesting. This comes from our old friend Alistair Taylor, thinking that this new opportunity could come through a chain of stores. Now, obviously, with Brian's background, since his family had founded the NEM stores on Merseyside, that kind of makes sense. And in fact, he even thought of it possibly as a chain of card stores, according to Alistair. And there's a wonderful book that came out actually a few years ago and has just recently been updated, called "Those Were the Days" by a fellow named Stephen Granados. And that book contends that actually Paul McCartney wanted the new venture to be a music publishing company, which is even more interesting when you consider Paul's later involvement with music publishing. And Paul also came up with the name Apple for the new company, kind of as a result of his involvement with kind of the art scene in London, things like that. And in fact, the Apple was thanked on the back cover of Sgt. Pepper. So Brian actually was quite gung-ho about the possibilities for Apple. But it was after Brian's death in August of '67 that the Beatles became more involved with the entity that was becoming known as Apple, rather than the Beatles and Company.
Right. Well, there was a huge amount of money that was needing to be managed, and unfortunately they were young, and they were, had this big weight on their shoulders. But as you mentioned, Brian tragically died on August 27th, 1967, to an accidental drug overdose. And with his death, everything, and I mean everything, changed for the Beatles, even bringing about a shift in group leadership. But for our purposes today, as we focus primarily on Apple, tell us, how did Brian's death change the corporate structure at Apple, and what was the relationship between Brian's NEMS Corporation, the group had once managed the affairs of the Beatles, and the embryonic Apple Corps? Well,
that was a problem, because the Beatles actually were they were fine with the concept of NEMS actually still keeping track of the day-to-day activities of the group. Mm-hmm. But Clive Epstein made it pretty clear early on that he really had no appetite for any kind of involvement with trying to manage the Beatles, and or be in any kind of a management position with NEMS. In fact, Ringo has talked about Clive being actually very kind of looking down quite a bit on the Beatles, okay, and considering them much more common than they actually were. So Clive wanted basically no part of them. But then there was Robert Stigwood. That's the other problem. Okay. Stigwood had been taken on by Brian as a partner in NEMS early in '67, and in fact he brought Cream and the Bee Gees to NEMS. But he really had his sights set on the Beatles. And really even before Brian died, the Beatles had pretty much told him they wanted no part of Stigwood.
Yeah.
And that if Stigwood tried to, kind of usurp Brian's position and become a manager and become their manager, that they would basically do nothing but release fart noises and denunciations of the Queen and whatever else instead of music until he finally quit. So they wanted no part of Robert Stigwood. So that meant that they basically, were kind of managing themselves, which turned out to be a problem.
Yeah.
So they decided to leave NEMS behind and get fully behind Apple. And in fact, Magical Mystery Tour was the first public Apple project.
Yeah. And we know how that went.
Yes.
Yeah, to me, every time that the Beatles are left to their own devices, they go to Hamburg and Alan Williams is managing them, and they learn to mock Shaw, and they're making advances, and then Alan sort of pulls away when they won't pay his 10% that second time, and Mona is hit or miss, and they start to kind of stumble. Fortunately, along comes Brian, and then as long as Brian's there, they're good to go. And then when Brian's not there, here they are, they're stunned, they're shocked, they're putting one foot in front of the other. And I think Apple kind of was helping to take their mind off of this unbelievable loss. I don't think anybody was prepared for Brian just suddenly, not being there, but someone did.
At that juncture, two of the Beatles' most trusted longtime associates really stepped up to the plate to fill that huge gap that was caused by Brian's tragic death. And one of them became the general manager of Apple, while the other one became the managing director. So Al, tell us a little bit about each one of those really special guys.
Well, the managing director was actually an old, actually the managing director and the general manager were each old hands as part of the inner circle. And the managing director was Neil Aspinall, who had been their road manager going all the way back to Liverpool.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, and so he was named as managing director of Apple, and he held that position and really was kind of like the keeper of the flame, the guardian, whatever label you want to put on him. He held that position until his retirement in 2007, which unfortunately was less than a year before his death.
Wow. That's a long time. I think about him making posters when he lived at Mona Best's house as a student, and he was making the very first posters that said the Fabulous Beatles. And, you know, we kind of credit him with being the one that came up with the Fab Four, because he's the Fabulous Beatles. And there he is all the way through to, you know, to his retirement.
Yeah, in fact, it's revealing that in the Beatles anthology, other than the Beatles themselves and George Martin, the only other person who is, you know, an on-screen talking head is Neil Aspinall.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. That shows you what kind of position he had and the respect that he had from the Beatles. But unfortunately, Neil wasn't much more of a business person than the Beatles were.
Yeah.
Which was part of the problem. But you mentioned the general manager.
Yeah.
And that was another old hand as part of the inner circle, and that is, again, just mentioned it before, our old friend Alistair Taylor, who of course was almost a regular at the fest for many years until his passing. But he became general manager, as you mentioned, at the behest of John Lennon. And in the early part of 1968, he would appear in the famous "This Man Has Talent" one-man band ad that appeared in New Musical Express and also in Rolling Stone, kind of soliciting new talent for Apple, none of which would ever actually pan out for Apple.
Yeah. But those were two great people who had been there all along. And, of
Absolutely.
course, you know, you have the other regulars who are still there. We spoke with Leslie Cavendish a couple of months ago, and he talked about his time at Apple and the fact that they even set him up with his own salon. And then, you know, he was there. And then, of course, Mal, you know, you certainly cannot have anything without Mal around. So
Absolutely.
I think they all had to step up to fill the very big shoes that were left by Brian. Just so sad, you know, so sad. Well, I just finished sort of rereading The Longest Cocktail Party by Richard DeLilio, and it is such an interesting book. In fact, I was surprised to find that the foreword was written by our very good friend, Wally Podrazik, who knows more about the Beatles than, I mean, the man is a walking Beatles encyclopedia. But there's so many things in there that we could discuss, like the house hippie and the days of Francine Schwartz and the Apple Scruffs and the boutique and all of that. I mean, we could have lots of shows about Apple, lengthy discussions. But, you know, for the sake of people listening who might not really be ingrained in all the particulars of Apple, kind of break it down for us. What were the divisions of Apple and what happened to each one of those?
Well, the first division that actually kind of came to fruition, if you want to put it that way, is Apple Music Publishing, because that in September of '67, an office for Apple Music Publishing opened at 94 Baker Street in London, headed by Terry Doran, who would be the head of Apple Publishing for its first couple of years. Probably the first major signing for Apple Publishing was actually a songwriter named George Alexander, and his writing partner and all morphed into a group that was actually dubbed Grapefruit by John Lennon. Right. And also there was also Jackie Lomax, was another artist or another writer that was signed to Apple Music Publishing. Well, Jackie, of course, was an old friend of the Beatles from their days in Liverpool, and when he was with a group called the Undertakers. Yeah. There was a group called Focal Point that was actually named by Brian Epstein. Which, you know, shows you that he certainly, at least early on, he certainly was very much in favor of the whole Apple project. And there was the songwriting team of Gallagher and Lyle, who some people may remember more from a group called, an early 70s group in England called McGuinness Flint. And also Mary Hopkin recorded some of their songs on her second Apple album.
Right.
And it's interesting. I have a birthday coming up, and our buddy Tom Frangione from the Fest and the Beatles channel sent me this. It's actually a 5-disc set called "Good as Gold: Artifacts of the Apple Era, 1967 to 1975." There's nothing on here. Well, no, there is one song that is actually an Apple Records release, but everything else on here are either demos or recordings that were made for Apple Publishing, or were made at the Apple Studios once they were able to reopen that in 1971 after all the damage that the infamous Magic Alex did. Yeah. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. But anyway, Apple Publishing was probably the first kind of effective division. Then you've got the other divisions were a mixed bag. There was Apple Tailoring, which basically nothing came out of Apple Tailoring. Right. There was Apple Electronics, which was the playpen of Yanni Alexis Martis. Who came up with numerous concepts, none of which amounted to anything, including the original concept for the Apple Recording Studio, in which the Beatles recorded most of what became the Let It Be album, only after they had to borrow equipment from EMI's Abbey Road studio to undo the mess created by Magic Alex.
But he's a genius, Al. He's a genius.
Right? Oh, yeah. You should get
the wrecking ball.
Really. You should get Alan Kozin on here to talk about Magic Alex.
Yeah.
You'll get an earful. Then there was Apple Films, which actually was the only other really successful division of Apple. Apple Films was the imprint for Magical Mystery Tour, for Yellow Submarine, for Let It Be, for the Concert for Bangladesh, the Ravi Shankar documentary Raga, the Mark Bolan T-Rex documentary Born to Boogie that was directed by Ringo, Son of Dracula with Ringo and Harry Nilsson, and Little Malcolm, which was produced by George Harrison and then distributed by Apple Films. Then another one. There was Apple Retail. Yeah. Which was chiefly basically the Apple Boutique. It was downstairs at 94 Baker Street, down below Apple Publishing, and was run by the Fool with Pete Shotton, John's childhood friend, as manager. And it was about as successful as Apple Electronics. The famous psychedelic mural painted on the side of the building had to be whitewashed because of neighborhood protests. The store never made any money because of customer and staff theft. And the boutique closed on July 31st, 1968, with everything being given away for free, but only after the Beatles and their wives and girlfriends took their share the night before the closing. Then there was Apple Publicity, which was helmed by Derek Taylor, and mainly was just to issue press releases regarding the Beatles and Apple Records artists, although there were certain times when Derek was pretty much besieged by the media, especially April 10th, 1970, when the news of Paul's not announcement, the Q&A that had been packaged with the press copies of the McCartney album. But the real success story for Apple was Apple Records, right? Which not only did it serve as the imprint for the Beatles releases from August of '68, actually technically right up to the present day. Yeah, because everything that's currently released on by the Beatles is still on the Apple label. But also, the Apple Records. I mean, note for note, it's probably the level of quality was probably about almost as good as almost any kind of a regular record label, on the Columbia RCA level,
right,
or even Atlantic. But some of the more, Elektra, Warner's, Reprise labels of that type, because you have James Taylor, you have Mary Hopkin, you have obviously Badfinger, which was the one really successful group, and so much more actually. Between the end of August of '68 when the first 4 releases came out, and basically the end of 1973, they released, not only the recordings by the Beatles as a group and in their solo career, but also a lot of great material.
Right. You said, am I hearing you right when you said Apple tailoring was one of the departments?
Yes.
It seems like that would have fallen under the auspices of the retail, or somehow those two could have overlapped. Don't you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm just scrolling back here. Apple, this is in February of '68. Apple registered its hoped-for divisions: Apple Electronics, Apple Films Limited, Apple Management, didn't even talk about Apple Management, Apple Music Publishing, Apple Overseas.
Uh-huh. Oh, wow.
Apple Publicity, Apple Records, Apple Retail, Apple Tailoring.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
Uh-huh. So Apple Overseas is where Ken Mansfield comes into the picture, because he's the head of the United States division of Apple. Very, very, very interesting. Well, so now we're going to put you on the spot, because if we gave you a magic wand and said, all right, Al, go back and you can change 3 things about Apple to make it really as successful as Apple Records, and to maximize its impact on the world of the late 1960s, what 3 things would you do?
Well, the first one is really tough, because it's one that really is you don't have a really tangible solution for, and that is that after Brian died, they needed to have a music-oriented but business-oriented business head, if you want to call it that, businessman. Somebody who would be actually, probably the best person that might have fit into a position like that, except that he was probably too young at that moment in time, was David Geffen, because this was still about 5 years before he formed Asylum. He was still kind of a neophyte in the business, but the problem was that there just were not that many kind of honest, music-oriented and business-oriented people. There were the sharks like Alan Klein.
Yeah.
And then
Stigwood.
There were and Stigwood. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's so ironic that a decade after he tried to take over the Beatles, that he ended up making this disastrous film that did great harm to the careers of the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton.
Really?
But somebody like Andrew Loog Oldham, or say Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp with The Who, were really more production oriented, even though they were technically managers. And so it's very tough to think of somebody other than somebody like a David Geffen, who could have kind of really directed the Apple ship of state. The second one is that in that period especially, the Beatles tended to treat everything like they would get very excited over something here and there, like remember the Greek island that they bought in '67, and I think they went there once and never went back.
Yeah.
And it was that way. Yeah, it was that way with almost everything.
Well, that's Alex Martis too. Same thing, I mean,
yeah, exactly.
He's going to make the best studio ever. He has a perpetual motion machine. Same. We're in this today, 100%, 200%. We're out.
Yeah, exactly. And it was if whatever they were into wasn't an immediate success, they would just dump it, and that was a problem, because they really never, even with the production work at Apple, if something didn't turn out to be all that successful, they just moved on to the next thing, and unfortunately a lot of deserving artists and also people in their lives, people like Mal Evans, got swept out to sea.
Yeah.
Basically. So if the Beatles had basically been more dedicated to these projects and stayed with them, I think that would have been a big plus. And kind of connected to that would be the third one, and that is that people like Mal Evans and a group like Badfinger, if they had really paid more attention to what was happening with them, especially Badfinger, because they were still connected with Apple while they were being ripped off and manipulated by Stan Polly, who deserves a prominent place in hell. And I think that if since the group was still, first of all, they shouldn't have let the situation get to the point where Badfinger left at the end of '73. They should have done their best to keep Badfinger on the label. And then they should have also been paying attention to what was going on with the group, because it's entirely possible that if more honest heads prevailed, Pete Ham and Tommy Evans might still be alive today.
Yeah.
So So I think if the Beatles had kind of paid more attention to things like that, obviously toward the the latter part of the Apple era, they simply they got bored with the label and just basically let other people handle it, and really just had their solo records issued on Apple, and didn't really care about the I guess the starkest example of that is the label of George Harrison's Extra Texture album, where the label shows a chewed up Apple, and that was of course the last album release on Apple, and the single of This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying was the last Apple single, at least of the original Apple era.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you happened to see Lena's presentation at Monmouth on the Beatles were the first millennials, but
yes,
so many of the characteristics that she was pointing out of millennials, the Beatles really had decades earlier, and one of them, Lena, isn't it this inability to stay on one thing, to the desire to move on to something else and to have now kind of results?
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's a very common, we hear it all the time in the music world. There's a lack of immaturity. There's a lack of importance placed on keeping your business together, generally with a lot of artistic people. And I think that's a big difference. And the Beatles were so young, and they weren't raised knowing business. Like you say, if Brian had still been living, there wouldn't have been any problem. It would have been, Brian may have made some missteps here and there, but things would have been foundationally wise set out for success.
Yeah.
And I think that's just so common. I can't even imagine today. You don't hear about it much, but artists today, they don't have records at the store getting bought by girls and the teen magazines, posters on the wall. Everything's just on their phone. And kids are paying $5 a month to Spotify to hear every song in the world. And it scares me to think what an artist actually gets these days. They can't be making anywhere near what artists made 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Especially given the last year and a half.
Yeah.
When so many of them haven't been able to perform at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it pains me to see these kids with their Spotify, and I'm like, you know how difficult it is to buy a song now, or it takes it's a little bit of work. I tried to buy a track the other day, and it took me a while to actually buy it.
Love Me?
Sadly, it wasn't.
That's my new favorite song, Al.
That is an awesome song. But sadly, those guys, they had other interests. They were very much sidetracked by their personal lives and their personal demons. And we've all been there. We've all been,
I'm there right now.
I'm so overwhelmed with what I have on my plate. You guys just take it on, and I trust you. And unfortunately, I know they had put trust in people that did not have their best interests at hand, and that is very, very common today too, and it's common for authors as well.
Yes, it certainly is.
But not me with my editors, best editors in the whole wide world, and that's the truth.
Well, Al, we so appreciate your insight into the inner workings of this multi-layered company that the Beatles entered into with their hopes of making the world a better place and the hopes of making dreams come true for singers, bands, songwriters, and performers all over the globe. As we all prepare to watch Peter Jackson's docuseries, The Beatles Get Back, in November, what you've shared with us, what you shared is an amazing backdrop to help us understand the interpersonal relationships we'll be encountering as we look back over the closing years of the Beatles 60 years later. Thank you so much, Al, for laying the foundation for us all and taking your time and answering all our questions and emails and texts. So we so appreciate you.
You're most welcome. It was Apple especially is a pet subject of mine. So it was. So this was a lot of fun. So
I just loved it. I didn't know an eighth of this. You are, and you know it. It's just rolling off your tongue. I mean, you know it. This is. I really, really appreciate it so much.
Oh, you're most welcome. It was my pleasure, and thank you thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Al. It's so good to talk to you. Hope to see you one of these days.
Yeah, one of these. Yeah, maybe next spring. We'll see.
Yes.
We're praying.
Let's hope.
We're praying.
Yeah. Keep your fingers crossed.
All right.
Okay, our deep dive into the world of the psychedelic Beatles continues over the next few months. Up next, we'll be talking with Dr. Robert Hieronymus and Laura Kortner about their new book, It's All in the Mind, Inside the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, Volume 2. And drum roll, please. Mark your calendars for the annual Best of show in November as we look over 2021 and herald the very best Beatles book releases of the year. We already have 6 great Beatle authors and experts lined up to share their stories, their books, and their secrets with you. So several of them will be giving you a sneak peek of new books slated for 2022. This will be an exciting interactive show that you do not want to miss. In fact, we're going to make it a Zoom event so that you can ask questions of our panel of authors and get the inside scoop on the Fab Four. That's all coming up on November 9th, 2021, the day, actually, that Brian Epstein discovered the Beatles in the Cavern Club in 1961. And more importantly, the day after my birthday and 4 days after Jude's birthday. So we'll really be in celebration mode. Get ready to have fab fun and chat with some of the best authors in the Beatles world. More details in the months to come. Thank you for following us on our She Said Facebook page and Instagram. And finally, don't forget to pre-order your copy of Shades of Life Part 1 at johnlennonseries.com and check out my Recipe Records rock and roll cookbooks at lenastagg.com. Until next time, here's to food for thought, food for the soul, and food for the love of rock and roll.
Ta-ra and shine on.